There we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. Happy to be with you today. We are broadcasting on Channel 9, and we're also live streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. And if you prefer to watch that way, it's easy to find. Just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon. I'm Mary Jacobsen, your host, and I'm so happy to welcome today's guests. We have visitors from the Custom House Maritime Museum this morning, one of Newburyport's most cherished cultural institutions. Joan Whitlow, the executive director, is here, and Sean Palmettier, the assistant director and curator. And later on in the show, I'm going to welcome Reverend Joan Mcpherson, the pastor of Main Street Congregational Church in Amesbury. She's going to be here to talk about white privilege and describe how it is woven into systemic racism in our country, and also to talk about why she feels the call as a pastor to advocate for racial justice. But right now, let me introduce you to Joan and Sean. Joan Whitlow got her BA in anthropology with a focus on museum studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She received her MA in museum studies through the University of Leicester, England's distance learning program. She has an impressive 30 years of experience in collections care and museum operations, 11 of them at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and then another 20 at the MIT Museum. She's also completed her project management master's certification coursework at Villanova University, and she's currently on the board of directors at the Danvers Historical Society. Sean Palmettier is an historical researcher of the material culture of early America. He studied fine art methodology and practice and art history at Montserrat College of Art, and he earned a master's degree focused on the history of New England in the early modern period, which is the 17th to the 19th centuries, from Salem State University. He's also done work with multiple organizations, including Historic New England and the Salem National Park site before coming to the Customs House. So Joan and Sean, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for visiting us today.
Well, this is really a wonderful opportunity, so thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I am going to start because I'm always curious about how people find their pathways in life. And I'd like to start by asking each of you what initially attracted you to the field of museum studies and working in museums in general, and then to the much loved Newburyport Custom House Maritime Museum in particular. Joan, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. I actually was brought up in Washington, D.C., where I was born, and I found myself spending a lot of time in my formative years at the Smithsonian. And it's a great place to go on rainy afternoons, meet with friends, and also have a date.
Wonderful.
And I just many different galleries, and I don't know if I was standing in front of a Neolithic stone weapon or tool or a beaded vase, but I remember just sort of standing in front of the case one day, realizing how special this place was, that not only was it sharing objects, but there was also giving you a little bit of information, and that anybody could really walk into a place and sort of find what was sort of their area of curiosity and learn something. And I just really found that to be really inspirational and something that would appeal to anybody. And so anthropology was sort of a nice fit for me because my interest is always all over the map. I like all the various components. I could never really focus in on one study. And so anthropology was a great way to knit together all the different disciplines and really see the world from a more holistic perspective. And then as far as how I came to the Customs House, I actually took early retirement from MIT. And I thought, you know, my husband said, you have a few more years of work. And I thought, well, maybe I could give something back to the smaller historical societies in the area and bring some professional level of expertise and wealth of knowledge that I've accumulated over the years. And the Customs House was a nice fit because the Peabody Essex Museum before that was the Essex Institute, and that was historic houses. So, you know, to have a historic structure as one of the largest artifacts in the collection, And then the Maritime, I feel like my life has sort of come full circle because Maritime was also at the Peabody Essex and the MIT Museum with its naval architecture and naval engineering collection. But I just felt that also it's a New England town, and I love the architecture. I love the being on a river in a stone building. I just feel so fortunate to go to work in that sort of environment that it embodies all of the values and loves that I cherished through my career.
Absolutely. It sounds like a perfect fit for you and a kind of a culmination of, it sounds like a really fascinating career in history and museum work. And it sounds like we're really lucky to have you. So how about you, Sean?
Uh, well, I started going to museums of various types as a child and just fell in love with the environment. There was always so much to learn that you could never learn it in one trip. So whether it was history museums or art museums or science museums, I was just enamored immediately by the kind of environment that the educational environment. And so when I went to college and started studying fine art, it seemed, kind of fortuitous that I was interested in that subject matter. And I really thought to myself one day walking through one of the museums that this is where I want to be. This is how I want to share this kind of knowledge and information with people is, through this kind of, environment of exhibit and contextualizing of historical documents and art and things like that. Getting involved with the Custom House started as an internship at the beginning of 2019. I was working with the collections, and the more I got to know the collection, the more I fell in love with it. It was just so varied. There was documents of all different types. There was artwork. There was tools of trades, and just the potential within the collection. I just immediately fell in love with it. And of course, like Joan said, the building itself is just amazing. It's early 19th century Greek revival structure, the classical architecture. It's just a wonderful place. So when I got the opportunity to initially brought in as a curator on the last exhibit, the pottery exhibit, and then the opportunity to start actually working for the museum, I was over the moon. So.
Oh gosh, first of all, I love a story like yours that involves an epiphany that this is for me. And also it's just wonderful to hear the passion and the enthusiasm that both you clearly bring to your work and the place for your work. So I think we're doubly lucky with both of you. So, well, I wanted to ask you, I'm pretty sure that neither of you expected you'd be spending the last several months behind closed doors because the museum had been shut down, like everything else since mid-March. But I believe you've been doing some significant renovations behind the scenes. So I was hoping that we might start by just getting an overview of some of the kinds of behind the scenes work that you've been doing while your doors were shut. Whichever of you would like to tackle that question to begin with.
Well, I could start, and then I think, Sean, you can tag team with me, but I would say that the winter hours were limiting just being open on weekends. So we were already sort of in our winter mode, and our winter goals were to refresh the galleries, make them a little bit more safer for the objects and presentation, and bring sort of the objects more into content and a variety of objects. And so Sean had been working on that. And I had done a lot more with the infrastructure and behind the scenes, sort of looking at a lot of just sort of the basics of the building, the heating system and drainage projects that we've worked on and ventilation and all. So making things safe and more presentable. But it's funny because at one point, I remember, Sean, when we were told to go home, we had just finished Monday. We had started our Mosley Gallery project, and I had taken everything out of the room completely, and we were raring to go. And that evening, we made the decision that we really should shut things down. And Sean and I were walking to our cars, the two of us, not knowing what the future held. And we both looked at each other and we said, this can be an opportunity. We can really get a lot more done in the time that we had sort of aggressively thought we could tackle. So from the very start, we kind of took the stance that we're going to make and use this time to the best, fullest means that we could. And I think that's been sort of the way in which we've embraced it, Sean. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And, I mean, just for my part, end of last year, I started to put together kind of a timeline, a plan for revising the galleries essentially one at a time, and over the course of the year. It was the original idea.
Yeah.
We were going to be, we're going to be open on the weekends, so we can only do so much that we had to make sure that it was, appropriate for people coming in, that, things weren't all over the place. So anything we did, we'd have to reset before we opened for the weekend, right? Once we were closed, it was like, okay, well, if we have this opportunity, like Joan said, let's take advantage of it. And so really it was over the course of the few months that, we've been closed down, started really aggressively digging into that timeline and accelerating it. So we, and in the end, managed to get a lot of projects done, the repainting and replastering and revising exhibits and all the installation and the new annual exhibit. So we actually did quite a bit more in retrospect than I think even we planned on doing. We were going to be ambitious about it, but I don't think even we thought we were going to get as much as we got done. So.
Well, it's wonderful to hear stories of any kind of silver lining to the pandemic. Really? And so it clearly provided the opportunity for you to do some things that you were wanting to do anyway. In the Daily News article about the renovations that I read, they talked about one of the plans that you've manifested at the museum was to try and turn some of the galleries into really storytelling exhibits to display the artifacts in such a way that they tell human and historical stories. Now, first of all, that sounds like a lot of fun, I'm sure, for both of you. And I was hoping that you might give us some examples of how you have transformed some of the galleries to this end, and perhaps a story or two that they now reveal.
I think we should speak to that.
Yeah. Well, there's such a variety of subject matter to draw from in the collection. There's so many wonderful objects and documents. And so the kind of guiding principle of revising the exhibits was, in doing so, to always bring in people, always bring in a person, a family, to contextualize the artifacts that we're putting on display. Because, an object without context is just an object, but in context, it becomes a historical source. So if you combine, multiple sources, that's how you start to tell these historical stories about how people lived, put a human face to it. I think that always makes history more real for people, is to see something. And it's not just an object. It's not just a lantern or it's not just a fire bucket or something like that, but you attach it to someone's life. And I think right now, one of my favorites that I did over the shutdown was on the Watts family. And I hope everybody comes in and sees this, but we had this portrait of a man named Captain Charles Watts up in the Moseley Gallery. And he just had a little label with him that said, his name, and that it was a painting. And as I started to look into our collection, it turned out we had a small collection of letters between him and his wife and his oldest son. And so I started reading through these letters, and unlike most kind of formal letter writing that you find in the 18th and 19th century, there was a lot of personal detail in it. There was a lot of inquiring as to how they were doing, and how William, the oldest son, was inquiring how his sisters were doing, to tell his brothers to get in touch with him, that he was going to send money home to his mother as soon as he got paid. So there was all these interesting little personal details that just made it so real. And so I wanted to put together kind of a timeline of these letters, and it's really one of my favorites, I think, of the stories.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. It sounds like something that everybody could relate to. And I like the way you put it, that an object is just an object, but when you put it in context and allow it to tell a story, it becomes our heritage, something that we all rest upon. And of course, we're all fascinated in that. That sounds fascinating. And it does sound like it was fun for you, Sean.
Very much, very much so.
Well, Joan, I know that in the Daily News article, it mentioned that one of your favorite items is a seaman's journal. And I was curious to find out what made this one of your favorites and what insights it revealed to you about these mariners' lives and times.
Well, I have to first preface this by saying that everyone always asks you, if you work in a museum, what's your favorite object? And for 30 years, I've avoided the answer, because I always sort of feel like I can never decide. But this sort of captured my, it drew on so many points. First of all, it's printed, you know, in the sense like, who would have known that there was a journal for young seamen to go off and record their journeys? You know, I mean, usually it's just a diary, but this is printed so that there's blocks on the pages as to, you know, the time slots and the direction of your going and what's the wind. And this was presented to Alexander Graves, and I would imagine he's probably a young man, early teenage years or something like that when you first go to sea. And the first couple of pages are really methodically documented. You know, every hour on the hour, he's recording the wind direction and where he's going. He's going to, I think, Charlestown. But like kids, you're enthusiastic to begin any new journey.
Yeah.
About this page in, you start seeing some doodles. And ships that he's seeing from his own travel. So he's drawing the ships that he's seeing in the ocean. And, you know, that sort of goes on for a couple of days, and then there's no entries. And then another page, and then it's Calcutta. And it starts all over again. Diligent recording, but lesser time. You know, he probably got more involved with the activities on board the boat, and the book sort of becomes secondary. For that to have survived is really rare. You know, first of all, most people, you throw out your childhood stuff. You know, as you move around the world, you lessen your load, and that's probably one of the first items to go. Sadly, he loses his life at sea many years later. He has his whole career. So I just sort of feel like, you know, here's this object left from this young man embarking on this wonderful journey of life and being so human characteristics of us all. Yes. You know, I think we can all identify with the enthusiasm, and then just realizing that I'm going to shift my attention to more fun activities on board the boat than fill in the pages of this book.
That sounds wonderful. And I understand when you describe what's rare about it being preserved. And it's an insight not only to what was happening on the voyage, but also his experience of it. I particularly can identify with the shift to doodling, you know. That sounds really wonderful. I can understand why it would be your favorite. Well, Sean, I wanted to ask you, you've curated the new featured exhibit with the intriguing title, Entertainment for Man and Horse, Victuals, Libations, and Distractions in an Early American Tavern. First of all, what gave you the idea for this exhibit?
Well, I think I first developed an interest in early American taverns while I was in grad school. I was studying some records of the Boston selectmen from the 1740s and 1750s, and came across an entry in their meeting notes where they were talking about getting the water pipes fixed for the sign of the orange tree. And I was like, isn't that interesting? You know, they're fixing water pipes and things like that. You know, some things never change. You're dealing with those infrastructural issues and things like that. And I was like, yeah, that's interesting. And I kept going and kept seeing references to the sign of the orange tree, the sign of the orange tree, the sign of the orange tree. Like, why are they talking so much about this place? Well, as it turns out, the sign of the orange tree was the tavern they were meeting at every month.
Okay, that would make it important.
and so that really kind of, you know, it sparked my imagination a little bit with, I mean, I think the general perception of taverns is more what our modern conception of a bar would be, right? So it's a place you go for drinks, maybe a bite to eat, but it's so much more. And the more you look into it, I mean, these city selectmen might meet there. All manner of business was done in the tavern. If you look through historical newspapers, as I started to do, you'd see all the things that were advertised in the paper that were going to be taking place at the local tavern. It would tell you where to go. And I mean, estates were settled there, things like that.
Oh.
So, you know, so I mean, so much actually goes into this location. It has such a place of importance in early American society. You know, I mean, the variety of subject matter you can draw from that, I think was, you know, just really appealing. And I thought, you know, the subject matter is one that broadly everyone is kind of familiar with, but once you get inside, you really dig into the details, it's so much more. And I thought, what a fun idea to try to do that.
Yeah, from what you're saying, it sounds like it did have some of the same functions as what we think of as a bar today,
Right.
when we go there for. But it sounds like it was also like a legal place, a civic place, and just provided many, many other functions.
Yeah.
How come, Sean, a tavern would be a place for political and legal activity instead of, for example, a town hall? What drew this variety of functions to basically a tavern?
Well, I mean, in Massachusetts in the 17th century, there were no civic buildings.
Okay.
So initially, so the court system was, I mean, based in Boston. The general court was based in Boston, but local courts, I mean, there was a quarterly court, a traveling court that would go into towns. And so that's one of the places that they would actually meet. Everyone knew where that was. They could usually accommodate a larger amount of people. So it became a de facto courthouse in the 17th century. So you have a lot of that tradition kind of going into it. It was just also a place where people met. It was a place where communication was a very big part of the tavern. Now it's where you would go not only for maybe local scuttlebutt, but you would also find international newspapers. So you would actually be getting global news at these places. And so it just kind of started rolling those things into it. I mean, it was a de facto post office in many cases. It was where on the post road, that's where the mail would come in. So it was one of those places that everyone knew where it was, and it took on a variety of different functions.
Well, that's just fascinating. It's always good to remember how life was different when there were just fewer buildings, fewer people, fewer institutions. And so you had them kind of synthesized into the taverns. Now, the title of the exhibit, Sean, it says Man and Horse. And so I'm curious to find out what role, if any, did women play in the taverns?
Well, I think the interesting thing, the fun I had a little bit of fun with people with the title, to be honest.
Yes, clearly, and it is fun. It provokes curiosity.
It was such an interesting grouping of words because it comes from a common phrasing used on tavern signs. And so, as I was going through a lot of the records and looking for images to use in the exhibit, that was the one that popped up repeatedly was entertainment for man and horse. And it sounds so funny to modern ears because, first of all, the word entertainment, we think of it as something of you sit down and are watching, something for pleasure, right? Someone's putting on a show for you or something like that. So entertainment for man and horse, you kind of conjures up an image of how are you entertaining a horse? It sounds kind of funny. And much in the same way too. I mean, in this case, the word entertainment means accommodation. So that's what it's kind of fun when you read historical sources, how many times the words that we take as having one meaning actually had a slightly different meaning in a different time period. So entertainment in this case would mean accommodation. And in the same way, the word man in the title is not actually referring to male per se. It's referring to, kind of the gender neutral, referring to people. So I guess the modern translation of the title would be accommodation for people and horses. Women's role in the tavern, I mean, first and foremost, women quite often were running taverns. I mean, more so in urban environments and port towns where you'd have more taverns, you'd have a lot more foot traffic. So you'd have, upwards of, maybe half the taverns in town being run by women. And a lot of cases, single women looking to earn a living, they had a place to have a tavern, they'd apply for a license. Older women, widows, would actually be given preferential treatment when they applied for tavern licenses because, they needed to earn a living. And, when they apply for these, they're applying to the local government. And the option was, well, either you can kind of grant the license so they can earn a living for themselves, or they have to basically go on public assistance. So oftentimes these petitions are given preferential treatment. So it's really kind of interesting. Beyond that, women worked in taverns. In addition to oftentimes running them, these are often family businesses as well. So even if the license holder is, say, the husband, the wife and the children are also working in these, businesses, whether it's trades or inns or things like that. They would work as barmaids. You think of these as hotels of their day. People are, travelers are coming through. So there are rooms with linens and things like that. You'd have laundresses who would also be working with these places. So, I mean, it can go and go and go as you realize everyone is involved in these kind of places. So then you just have the variety of types of taverns you get based on the kind of social structure. So for instance, taverns that catered more to the upper classes had a kind of different feel than the ones who dealt with the laboring classes. And what's interesting about that is by the end of the 18th, early 19th century, you do have the emergence of taverns that catered exclusively to more upper class men. And then the laboring class taverns would really have a far more representative cross-section of the population who were patronizing it. So it was much more egalitarian. So it depends on where you're looking as to what you're seeing, but women played as much of a role as men did. And I think that again comes down to the structure of society where, a lot of times I think our perception of societal standards from the past does come down from the upper classes, the top 1%. But they're not necessarily representative of the population, whereas the rest of society, everybody worked.
Yeah.
So
some things are always true.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. Well, Sean, that sounds just fascinating. And some of those things, like the women running many taverns, that's just not what I would have expected. That's really fascinating to find out. It sounds like there's so much to be learned about taverns because they were a hub for everything. It sounds like that sounds just fascinating. Now, I know you've been open at the museum now for about a week after being closed and using that to good effect. So how are the timed admissions going? And also, how can people get a timed admission?
I think they're going quite well. I mean, we really don't know or had any real expectation. We have set up the time admission through a ticket online, tickets.thechmm.org. If you're a Newburyport resident or a member, they're free, but we still ask that you do a timed admission because we have it set at 6 people per hour on the hour. But we also want to be able to accommodate walk-ins because we're right there on the foot traffic, not only on Main Street, but also the bike path. So, surprisingly, it seems that we're getting just about equal walk-ins. And I think a lot of times it's people just arriving to come to Newburyport. I always ask people where they're coming from and how they find out about us. And I think they're just so excited that the museum is open. So I think it's going well. Personally, I think it's going to be gradual, and we really felt that we should proceed cautiously. So our marketing is a little bit low scale just because we wanted to make sure that we could accommodate and have everything working smoothly. But I think in the next week or two, things will pick up more so.
Well, that's really wonderful. I'm really glad to hear that it's going well and that you're able to allow for some walk-in traffic, because I know people have been missing you and missing the First Fridays for sure. But I know that you've adapted and gone virtual with your First Friday talks. And I know you also have a YouTube channel, and not everybody may know that. So could you tell us a little bit about what kinds of things people can find on your YouTube channel?
Do you want to take that, Sean?
Sure. Well, we didn't really utilize the YouTube channel too much in the past. We've had it for a while, but we're really focusing in on in this time, of course, with virtual engagement. And so, in addition to the streamed First Fridays, which we're putting on the YouTube channel, we're also trying to build other types of content. Historical talks. We're putting together a variety of different kind of videos and things like that. We have a playlist there on. For Yeet Yeet Don't Tell Me, which Jack Santos, one of our board members, does every couple of weeks with the Historical Society of Old Newbury. So we're trying to build it right now. And if you go to YouTube and you just put in the search engine Custom House Museum, it'll come up with the channel with our logo, and you can kind of see. And if you subscribe, we're going to be putting more content on there as time goes on.
And not for nothing, you can also hear Mike Welch sing tavern songs on your YouTube channel, which is great fun. I have one final question I'm dying to ask both of you, since I really like museums and they've been an important part in my life, ones that I have a special fondness for. And so I wanted to ask each of you if you have a special exhibit that's been particularly impactful for you. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing I mean. I used to live in Arlington, so it was much closer to Cambridge, and I just loved the Harvard Natural History Museum. And they had an endangered species exhibit there once, and there were a number of things well done, but the one that stayed with me was they had just a simple large glass case in the middle of the room. And the case was filled with the tiny desiccated bones, thousands and thousands of tiny desiccated bones of a bird species. I don't remember the name of the bird species, but I remember the impact of seeing all those desiccated bones of a bird that had gone extinct. And there also used to be a quirky little museum in Lexington. I don't know if either of you had ever heard of or been to the Museum of our National Heritage in Lexington, which strangely was run by the Masons. But they used to have the quirkiest, they had an exhibit on diners. They had an exhibit on Route 66, but the one that made an impression on me and has stayed with me, this was years ago and I'm still talking about it, as you can see, was called Beautiful Daring Western Girls. And it was about the women performers in the Wild West shows whose, history had been kind of marginalized, and yet learning about them was, well, they were beautiful and daring. and so it was an opportunity to fill in at a missing chapter of history. So those are museums I just actively would look forward to each new exhibit. So I was curious to find out from each of you if there was a particular museum or exhibit that really inspired you as part of your journey to be doing the kind of work that you are doing today. Whichever of you would like to begin.
You want to go first, Sean?
Sure. I think the one that kind of springs to mind really is actually the Saugus Ironworks National Park site, because it incorporates so many of the things that I love about seeing history exhibits. It incorporates certainly the artifactual elements. They did a dig there in the 1950s where they started unearthing all these original objects from the original ironworks, and the way they incorporate the human element into that. Also environmentally, I mean, you get to go there and see the reproduction that they have there, the kind of working water wheel and things like that they would have been using, but its connections then to the people who were living there in the 17th century Massachusetts, to the early Puritan settlement in Massachusetts, the connection to the English Civil War and the workers who they brought over, who they were captives in the English Civil War, they brought to work in this place, and how that developed. Early industrial history. It encompassed so many different elements of historical storytelling, and did so beautifully, and still does so beautifully through a lot of the objects that they unearthed.
Wow.
So
I'm going to have to go there. I'm glad you told us about that, Sean. That sounds amazing. How about you, Joan?
Well, I have to admit, I like going to all museums.
Fair enough. And not surprising.
I even go to the children's museums.
Oh, that's a great museum.
Well, any museum, whenever I'm visiting someplace, I always try to take it in, because I feel like there's so much I can learn from them, how they either showcase something or how they tackled a problem of how to display something. So I always sort of like to go with my eyes open to learn and to explore and see how they've solved their problems. But one thing that I always really love is, amongst all this sort of high-end aspect are these hidden gems, the small town little historical societies or places that are having displays. And one in particular that always comes to my mind is the Bates Museum in Hinckley, Maine. And in Hinckley, Maine, there is a Goodwill school for troubled boys that was built early on in the 1900s. And the man thought to also include a museum, coming back to that same evocative, the values of the Smithsonian, and trying to make things accessible, inspire, and at the same time teach, in a different format than in a school academic sense. And this museum is natural history, but as much as they are small and not necessarily in the competition of the MFA and the numbers and the scale, I feel like they really embody the values of the core of what museums' missions are. So I will dismiss the cobwebs and the little cars. My son has been taking me to I think it was San Antonio, a dance hall. And the dance hall was a museum.
How wonderful.
So there's, Earl
Yeah.
Ives or, whoever the
Yeah.
performers that came through on the rodeo
Yeah.
shows. And, they have his hat or his guitar, but, there's flies in the cases and all. But I just think that that is so charming. And I really always find a special place in my heart to explore places like that.
Wonderful. Hidden gems for
Yeah.
sure. Absolutely. Joan and Sean, I can't thank you enough for coming on the morning show and sharing these stories with us. And I hope you come back. Next time there's an exhibit, Sean, for sure, you have to come back and tell us about it, okay?
Absolutely.
Keep us posted. And thank you so much. It's just been a joy to have you here. I've loved talking to you, and I can't wait to go see the Colonial Tavern exhibit and the Seaman's Journal. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming to the morning show. You take care now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
So now we're going to shift gears, and I'm looking forward to welcoming the Reverend Joan Mcpherson. She is a second career pastor, having worked previously as an efficiency and quality engineer. But then in 2004, she got the call to serve as a pastor of the Main Street Congregational Church in Amesbury. And let's see if we can get Joan on screen at this point. Joan came to my attention because of a wonderful article that she wrote for the Daily News called The Cost of Justice, in which she talked about how her work as a pastor led her to feel that she really needed to take an activist role in bringing about racial justice and harmony. Let's see, Lily, if we can get Joan on screen, get the video. There we go. Hi, Joan, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, wonderful. Yes, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to begin because as I was talking with Joan and Sean earlier, I'm always curious about how people find their pathways in life. And so I'm very curious, how did you find your way from engineering into becoming a pastor?
Well, that's sort of a dangerous question to ask, because in the ordination process, we have to answer that time and time again. And I'm a preacher, so I could go on for a really long time about that. But it like, not to be, sort of snarky about it. It was the God thing, which was just different for me. I had a great career. I knew it wasn't where I was supposed to be, and but I didn't know where I was supposed to be. And really, one morning I woke up and I'm like, oh, parish ministry, that's all the pieces. And there you go. It was, yeah, then I started, and it seems to.
Well, so you had an epiphany.
Yeah.
That's great. Sometimes life just brings us those moments of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to talk to you. I really liked, as I told you when I was reaching out to you to invite you on the show, I really, really liked your article, The Cost of Justice. You gave such a straightforward, accessible, and persuasive portrait of what white privilege is and how it results from and reinforces systemic racism in the United States. So first, I would like to ask for your thoughts on why it is important for white Americans to understand the privilege that comes with our skin color in America.
Well, I think without knowing that, we continue to reinforce patterns of judgment and blame, assuming that people who don't have white skin have the same opportunities that I have had, and that if they are not soaring and excelling in the white culture in which I live, then they are flawed and not able, and less capable, as opposed to they are operating in a different system with different circumstances. And if I don't know that, then I think we judge.
Yeah, if you don't know it and others, you won't see what's right there in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
White privilege, I'm sure is a term that that some white people just recoil from. They just don't feel, they can't relate to it. They feel like it can't possibly fit them or their lives. So I wonder, what are some of the reasons that you've observed that lead some people to see that phrase negatively or to feel that it just can't possibly apply to them?
Right. I think part of it is the actual word privilege and how often privilege is used culturally as an economic term. And so we think of people in a higher economic bracket, born with a silver spoon in their mouth, have had everything given to them. And plenty of white people are not in that circumstance and have worked very hard for everything they have. And they've had challenges and disappointments, and they don't feel privileged in that economic term.
Yeah.
And so, so they don't feel like they belong in that. And I think the other part has become some shame or embarrassment or guilt that I have white privilege, not because I chose to be born white. I have it, and now it becomes mine to say, how do I use that privilege to matter for those who have not had access to that privilege?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me.
In your article, welcome.
Very professional, the very professional home Zoom, yes.
Yeah, no, that's one of the great things about Zoom is you get to see little glimpses of people's homes. And also, if you're really lucky, they're pets.
Well, do that for a minute.
So, in your article, you talked about how, clarifying that white privilege isn't something that we've chosen, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're economically privileged, but it's something we're born to. If we're white in this country, we're born into a system that privileges our skin color. But you talk about how white people need to be, you use the word I like a lot, intentional, that we need to be intentional about uncovering the working of white privilege in our lives. And I was hoping you might say a little bit more about that and maybe give an example of how people need to be and can be intentional.
Well, I think if we're not intentional, and I mean, I could very easily have continued living within my bubble of white people in primarily white suburbs and watching the news and making judgments about people who were being crushed at the expense of the system. So I've been privileged in some way, forced upon me, or I did some with intention once I started to learn. But once I started reading and talking to people and having my heart and eyes opened, it just became more and more imperative to dig in more. And I realized I need to read different things that were on the syllabus of my junior high and high school. I need to expose myself to other authors, travel, meet people, and because I have lived primarily in white communities. So it would be very easy to not think about, consider other folks.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess part of what's implicit in what you're saying is to becoming aware of white privilege, know that there are whole histories of other races and people of color that just were not part of the curriculum that we were taught in school. It's not that the history isn't. Pardon?
There were people in America before Columbus came?
I hear tell a few. Yeah, exactly. Another distinction that you make that I think is a really important one to clarify is, could you explain why being a racist, a person who is a racist, is different from participating in a racist system, and why it's so important for us to understand that distinction?
Racism work out and really emphasized recently that I think some of my language is a little outdated now, and I'm trying to catch up to the Ibram X. Kenci's work and all that about anti-racism. But my understanding of racism would be my making declarative statements and actions, devaluating, degrading, holding back someone because of their skin color, which is not anything I hope I have ever done or will do. And so the racism part is the actively living out opposition or against someone of another skin color. The racist system is that the white privilege is comes out of having a system and a culture that is systemically racist. And I am born into it and I am part of it. No matter how much I love or care about my brothers and sisters of color, I'm still part of a racist system.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I think so. Because sometimes I think when people hear systemic racism, they think that somebody is accusing them of being a racist. And it's a very different thing. It doesn't mean that you individually are a racist or would ever deliberately engage in racist actions or take racist, be violent or derogatory, but that as you were describing about white privilege, that we're kind of born into a racist system, and then we can be intentional about understanding how we become implicated in it, I guess would be one way to put it. If we don't become intentional about understanding how, without intending to, we're participating in something that is oppressive to many people.
Right.
So. Well, one of the things that I really valued about your article were the specific historical examples of systemic racism. Starting with, you talked about the GI Bill, which of course was passed after World War II. And you mentioned that your parents had benefited from the GI Bill. Your father got an education in pharmacy. But could you fill in the dots about how and why this benefit didn't necessarily help Black veterans of World War II the same way that it did white veterans, and why that mattered to the generation of baby boomers, of which I'm a part?
Yeah, I can sort of, I feel like I don't have all my resources able to footnote and cite exactly as we speak here, but from the readings and the pieces that I've done, a big part of the GI Bill was the opportunity for education. And in that time, primarily vets of color were not eligible to be admitted at really 99% of the white colleges and universities. There were some of the historically Black colleges and universities accessible, but primarily vets of color were pushed toward vocational schools. So they just didn't have access. The benefit was there, but they didn't have access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, which makes a huge difference.
Right.
Education makes a huge difference in terms of the kind of jobs that you'll be able to get. And then, your introductory salary in a job, it kind of sets a bar for the increments in your salary that go forward from there. Along those lines, though, you also mentioned redlining, and it made me think about how any financial advisor any of us ever consult, the first thing they say you need to do to build equity and to establish financial security for yourself and your retirement, to have something you can pass along to your children, is buy a house. Right. And so you talked a bit about redlining and that practice. And could you tell us a little bit about what you learned about redlining and how that has impacted and economically disadvantaged Black people?
Right. Well, I think there are two parts. There's redlining, and then there was actually that many fewer vets of color were awarded mortgage loans through the VA. So, first of all, those vets were receiving the opportunity at a much lower rate. It was less available, but redlining was a practice that prevented people of color from buying property in particular areas. So we redlined out the up and coming, the good school systems, the already established neighborhoods. And so even, with the limited number of loans that were available, then the pie got reduced further to say, well, this is where you can buy your house. And this is actually where no one wants to live. Because it's depressed economically, it's unsettled, it's whatever. So, and part of what I said in my story was, my sort of aha, took me a long time to catch up about, my parents bought a tiny ranch house in the town where they had been raised because of the GI Bill. They could not have afforded that house on their own. Mm-hmm. But once they were able to buy that tiny house in the town, it went up in value. You can
leverage upward.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, another story that you talked about, a friend of yours, Susan, who lives in Nebraska, and you also told an interesting story about the research she did on how her family was able to acquire that land in
Right.
Nebraska.
Right. So that was the Homesteading Act in 1862, and where the U.S. government granted, with a clause, 160 acres of land to any citizen who would farm it for 5 years. And if you farmed it for 5 years, then the land was yours forever. Native Americans and African Americans were not eligible for that grant. So
Yeah.
that whole chunk, that whole swath of the US got settled. And people worked hard and they farmed and they did all that. And then this is the systemic part and the intentional part. It could be easy to turn around and say, look how hard my family worked to get where we are now. Oh, but wait a minute. We got 160
Right.
acres of land given to us.
Right. That's right.
Some of
You had
which
a
was
leg
taken
up.
from you. Right?
That's right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Joan, it strikes me, these are often missing chapters in the history that we're taught.
Mhm. Yeah.
About that's systemic racism, folks, right there. And often we don't know about it or don't understand it, or some people deny that it's there simply because their history of how we got there is forgotten. So that's another thing that I really valued about your article, the straightforwardness with which you reminded us of some of these historic advantages that white people have had. Again, we might not have chosen, we weren't there to choose that policy, but we certainly benefited from it generationally. So I also wanted to ask you, what do you feel that that as white people we're called upon to do, perhaps to level the playing field, if that's a good phrase? What are some of your thoughts about, what can we do or should we do? Can we choose? Any of those verbs will do. Your thoughts about that?
Well, it's complicated for sure. I think we have a lot of work to do, but I also want to be careful about thinking that we as white people are the ones that are going to level, because it's a part of it. I think it's more that we need to become allies. I need to recognize where the hill is, and I need to stop reinforcing my hill.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I need to make room for you to carve it down a little bit, or a lot, actually. I think there's a part about where I talk about learning intentionally, but also giving up guilt about it. I mean, I can feel guilty about behavior I do now that's not okay. But if all my time is guilt and defensiveness about the system that got me where I am, I'm not doing anything to help it change.
Absolutely.
So I want to recognize that it's there and then say, okay, what can I do with the privilege that I have? And so some of that is reading, learning, finding out how to become an ally to people who are trying to recreate the system in a more just way, but not me deciding what that looks like for them, but how can I help?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm glad that you put it that way. It's really important. So as allies then, and being intentional, are there other examples of things that we can all do, or things that you've read, or films that you've seen, things that you have found helpful in cultivating your allyship?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a book person, so that's my answer for many and most things. But there's things on screen that people can
I'm a
read
book
and
person
look at,
too.
or podcasts. But and I think finding, there are lists, certainly lots of lists out there. But for me, reading books by people of color, hearing their perspective and their stories has been really important. And then I'll start with one that's not. It's by a white woman that we read in our social justice book group many years ago at our church, Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, which felt like a very approachable book for white folks to read and understand about privilege without judgment, but just, how we have been conditioned. Just read I'm Still Here, Austin Channing Brown's book that was, I think it's Black Dignity, Finding Black Dignity in a White World. Again, really powerful and accessible. Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson. That's a book I read ages ago, but I believe they made that available free to stream in the wake of
Amazon
George
Prime.
Floyd.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Or even novels, Toni Morrison was very formative for me. I think we can approach this on many different levels. I mean, there's the academic, really dense stuff. It matters, but I can't always read that. But a novel can help along the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I know for me, once you start reading one thing, it leads to another. And then there's an abundance of resources, fiction, nonfiction. I myself have become I didn't study history growing up. I was an English major, but I've become very aware of how history has so many answers. It kind of clarifies how we got here. Right. So, I'm enamored. A few weeks ago, I had Kate Larson on, the author of a biography of Harriet Tubman called Harriet. And part of what she talks about, and there's the concept the historians have of the usable past, and how a lot of the history of slavery and the Civil War was distorted over time because the country needed to get back together again. And so we wind up being ignorant about a lot of the actual horrors of what went on. So the main thing is, I think, get started. Joan, I have to thank you again for writing that piece for the Daily News. I recommend everybody. It was June 26th, everybody. Go find it. And you did a wonderful job. You write very well because it's part of its persuasiveness is its simplicity and straightforwardness. And yet the examples you give are powerful and they make the point. I want to thank you very much for coming on the morning show to share with us. And if anybody wants to learn more about you or your church where can they find you? What can they do, Joan?
So we're the Main Street Congregational United Church of Christ in Amesbury. It used to be that you would come and worship with us by walking through the big green doors by the library downtown. But now you can join us on Facebook, where we stream every Sunday at 10.
Great.
And so that's the easiest way to get connected now.
Yeah. Well, all right. Thank you so much, Joan. It's been a joy to talk to you. And once again, thank you for writing that article. It was wonderful. You're a gem. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Well, that's it for today's show, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll join us next Thursday on the morning show when I'm pleased to welcome 3 experts on suicide prevention. There have been a lot of well-documented reports of the negative impacts of the pandemic on mental health in general, particularly depression and anxiety, but also a lot of concern expressed about possible spikes in suicidal thoughts and attempts. So my guests will help us understand those impacts and what to look for and resources to tap. They'll also widen our lens on these issues to look at how racial disparities in the delivery of mental health services can have an impact on suicide prevention. I'll be welcoming Debbie Helms, who's director of the Samaritans of Merrimack Valley, Jennifer Kelleher, managing director of the Mass Coalition for Suicide Prevention, and Dr. Pata Suyamoto, who's an educator and independent mental health activist. So if you missed part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on the Port Media YouTube channel playlist for the morning show, www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and then the following Tuesday at 4 and Wednesday at 3 and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and then scroll down. As we end today, I want to thank our producer, Lily Doucette, who's been doing a wonderful job producing the morning show for the last month. Kudos, Lily, and gratitude. That's it for today, everybody. Please join us back on the air next Thursday at 9 a.m. for the morning show. Thank you. Take care. Have a wonderful week.